Hi, you've heard it before. People who argue that success in business or startups or innovation is all about the idea. You've probably also heard people arguing that no, it's about execution. Execution matters. And then the debate ensues, and these people know, they are confident, and they've been through it. And there's some element of this debate that's important. There's some element of it that's absolutely moot, in my opinion. But on the legitimate side, I think we're getting lost in some of the semantics. There are new processes and new words being put out there that I want to tackle a little bit here. And I think we need a little bit of a new way of framing some of this. So we want to move from this debate and talk about the punchline is deliberate opportunity design. So on the idea matters side, you often start with the question then, okay, how do you come up with a good one? That elusive, really good idea that's going to take you forward, if the idea is what matters. Well, I'm going to start with the work of Balaji Srinivasan, who talks about a maze. He says it's not just one idea, so he's shifting us already, which is good. And he says a good idea actually means a bird's eye view of the idea maze, this concept he has of, well, you can enter at different points, but it's not enough to just know about where you would enter. You have to know about the permutations and the possible outputs. And he goes further to talk about execution, which I like, as the execution mindset being running the maze rapidly. So he's got this shift in thinking just from idea, and he's trying to tie idea and execution together. He says you think through the branches, and you look at all the permutations. And his idea is that a new strong path through the maze is what's important. So I thought I'd start there today with his ideas, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. He's shifted us from idea versus execution to idea and execution, and he talks about this maze of good ideas. He also leaves us, as I've said, with the notion of a path or a continuum, and you can read his lecture notes. It's a Coursera course called Startup Engineering. There's also been some recent blogging by these two folks on these concepts, which you can look at. The Twitter feeds are right there, and that was interesting too. One jumping on the maze idea, and the other saying, yeah, I'm not so sure about the maze idea. I prefer to look at it as a continuum. I thought actually that I would use that to start my reframing. Use the continuum to get a conversation started about how we might look at this a little bit differently. So here's a continuum, and if you're familiar with businesses and startups and innovation, you may have come across things like this. The most basic level, stuff we do, perspective of this, would be on the left, we think of it at the beginning, somewhere in the middle we're going to launch this thing, and somewhere towards the end we're going to sell it. That's the most basic that we have. In there you can get a little more detailed, and there's lots of life cycle models. Ideation, planning, launching, executing, and growing are shown here. There's also financing and all kinds of other elements of this that you can put on there, all into the stuff we do. Fairly basic, intuitive. I hope already, though, you can see that idea versus executing is kind of simplistic. The other challenge this highlights, though, is that a lot of people enter here. And that is a challenge that I'm going to talk about today. A lot of people start with the planning. You go into a bank and they want a business plan. And people start by writing their idea down as a business plan and just have skipped a bunch of steps. So we're left with that kind of challenge. It's not just idea versus executing, and we often start perhaps at the wrong place. There's another useful perspective, a very practical book on Excel, use of Excel for financial models by Tom Sawyer, and he has these proof of concept idea or value milestones. Proof of product, proof of market, cash positive, and proof of scale. So just another way to look at the time element, or the continuum, if you will. The challenge I have here is, how do you know, I mean, that's good, I buy those, but how do you know you're on the right path? How do you know you have the right product? How do you know you have the right market? Often we make assumptions and don't test them enough. That's where a lot of the conversation's coming these days, from lean startup to business model generation to all those kinds of things, is on testing those assumptions, testing the hypothesis. Whatever one of these you have on the timelines you're looking at, the challenge is that the odds of success decrease as you go down this process. And I often like to use this to demonstrate that. It's the work of Stevens and Burley, who said that for every 3,000 raw ideas we have, there's roughly 2 that launch, and roughly 1, only 1, that is what they deem to be a success. So they said the odds are, and I've done the math crudely here with a bit of a rounding error, but the odds of success are 0.03%, which is very, very small, 1 in 3,000. You can look at basic statistics that are available to see that the odds of being around 5 years later, factored into this, leave us with about a 0.02% chance of a raw idea making it to 5 years later. And of course, the challenge is we don't want to just make it to 5 years later. We want those really big value ideas, that 0.01%, nope, 0.001%, a very small, something like 1 in 120,000 odds of an idea getting to be those big ideas that we all talk about, the ones we all look back on very easily and point to. But how do we get there when we're at the beginning is the challenge. So the odds are tough. So I'd ask you to, instead of these continuums that we normally look at, and these events or milestones on these continuums, let's look at those that I've drawn with the yellow dots. And I'm going to call these prototypes of the opportunity. In fact, I'm going to show you a couple, one being the hunch, the idea, the concept, and the opportunity, small o opportunity. The napkin, back of the napkin, is a prototype of your opportunity. It's at the hunch stage, very early stages. More familiar might be the idea model. At least this is something I'm trying to get people to work with, is after that back of the napkin stage, model your idea. Then a prototype is the business model, very well known, lots of traction here, lots of interest here. And then the most well-known prototype of the opportunity is the business plan. So you've got these ways of modeling and prototyping the opportunity. We can look at them further this way. I like just splitting those on the left that we just saw, the plan and the business model and the idea model, and calling those the variables. They're the things we can change, the prototypes we can create. Coupling that with a set of criteria, and this is very important to give us this notion of prototyping and modeling of an opportunity, or opportunity design, more broadly speaking. Those criteria that I showed you very simply look like this. High impact and high feasibility is where we want to be. And I call that the really big value zone. And this is to get back to basics and say, this is about strategy. This is about creation of value. There's nothing magical about this, despite all the language that we use. So what about that? Well, if you go through an iterative process where at each stage on that continuum, or each of those yellow dots I showed you, do this. You see it from the last stage. You design or sketch the concept out, build that prototype. You seek feedback so that you can critique that prototype. And you keep going around that cycle until you get into the top right corner, or until you've demonstrated value as highly confidently as you can. And then you only jump out of that cycle at that stage with that prototype. You keep prototyping at that stage until you hit that top right corner, or you meet those criteria. So in our timeline, it looks something like this. Now we have sort of a discrete nature in that there are the prototypes we're used to, as I've talked about here. But for each one of those, you iterate and design until you meet the criteria, and then you move along. Here's a quick sketch of those different prototypes to remind you again. And I've sort of framed it in words this way. The whole thing I'm talking about here is deliberate opportunity design, where you seed, you model the idea, you model the business, and you do the business planning. And these are all examples of opportunity models, or prototypes of the opportunity. So let's get back to my point. Get back to where I want to leave you today. We started with the work of Balaji Srinivasan, who talked about shifting from idea versus execution and put the idea of a maze on the table. Well, I wanted to reframe things. I'm going to jump off here with the word, I jumped off with the word continuum and talked about evolution. I've shown you how there's really tough odds. I mean, it is kind of an evolution. Ideas come up, some survive, some die off, and the odds of being there at the end are very low, just like evolution. And I want to talk about the notion of a path, and I've said how it can be deliberately designed, and we're talking about value creation. To get back to basics, to ignore all the words that we often use, including words I've used here, we're talking about value creation. We're talking about a strategic approach, iteratively, but a strategic approach of trying to create value. So I'd say to you, don't leave it to chance, or even to running a maze quickly. Thank you very much. You can find more at theinographer.com/toolkit/idea modeling.